I am so excited to be part of virtual JaneCon again this year. Welcome, everyone, to my presentation. I am sure that you have been viewing so many wonderful presentations already this year. For those of you who attended last summer, you may or may not remember me. My name is Sydney Fargus, and I presented on Jane Austen's bookshelf last year. This year, I'm returning with a completely different topic, but still revolving around our beloved Jane Austen. I did want to begin with a brief introduction to myself, um, especially for people who are not familiar with me. So, as I said before, my name is Sydney Fargus, and I am an educator. I've been an educator primarily at the high school and collegiate levels for the past 11 years. But obviously, at my core, I am an Austen scholar, and I specialize in both Regency and Victorian literature. I attended University of Rochester for my undergraduate degrees, and I got my master's at George Washington University. As an educator over the years, I have designed countless content, curriculum, and crafted many lectures, all with the specific aim of bringing literature to life for my students, all with the specific goal of encouraging my students to think about the authorial intent behind the texts that they are reading. As I said before, this is my second presentation for virtual JaneCon. So excited to share with you a brand new topic and one that's very close to my heart. So I decided to focus on mothers and daughters this year because I am expecting my first child in September. And over the course of my pregnancy, I really realized that I have been focusing solely on literature that revolves around the presence or the lack thereof of maternal figures. And even in my rereading of Jane Austen, I reread Jane Austen every year. I'm sure some or many of you do the same. And every year I get something different out of my rereading. I focus on something different. This year I really found myself focusing on parenthood, motherhood, and the dynamics between mother and child. So that is what drove me to present on this topic. I'm really excited to bring you along with me on this brief but hopefully illuminating journey of examining the various mothers and daughters within Jane Austen's novels. So without further ado, welcome to my presentation, Anxious Mothers and Independent Daughters, Maternal Authority in Jane Austen. So I want to begin by talking about most memorable characters in the hopes that it will also lead you to think about the characters that we don't reflect on quite as often, or perhaps even at all. It's the daughters, the heroines, who we really remember, right? Elizabeth Bennet, Anne Elliot, Eleanor Dashwood, Emma Woodhouse, and Fanny Price. Her heroines remain beloved because they grow through self-knowledge and moral development. They have a strong presence within her texts. As daughters, they also play a significant role. And that's important to keep in mind, especially within the context of this presentation. So daughters play a prominent role in Jane Austen's books. One could make the argument that it's the daughters we best remember. Even someone who's not as familiar with Jane Austen's novels are often going to be able to claim some sort of recognition to the likes of Elizabeth Bennet or Marianne Dashwood, even if they've only seen the movie adaptations. The other characters, especially the mothers, are not as frequently discussed, not as frequently remembered. Now, when it comes to the daughters, aka the heroines, I think, in my opinion, at least for me anyway, we clamor over Elizabeth Bennet's wit. We admire the quiet strength of Anne Elliot. We acknowledge Eleanor Dashwood's composure. We applaud Emma Woodhouse's self-discovery, and we commend Fanny Price's unwavering morals. Her daughters have endured because they are sharp individuals who ultimately come to understand themselves. The journey that they go on from start to finish is really, in my opinion, quite enthralling. But what about the mothers? Why, why is it that we don't think about them quite as often? Why is it that they receive far less attention, critical or otherwise? That's what I'm really asking you to consider as we move through this presentation. Why is it that the mothers seem to be forgotten? Because if we're not going to be talking about Austen's daughters or Austen's heroines, then more often than not, we're talking about the counterparts, the men whom the daughters end up entangling themselves with. And yet, mothers play a really crucial role. So, again, why is it that they receive far less attention, with the exception perhaps of Mrs. Bennet? And can we really count Mrs. Bennet as being properly remembered when so often she's remembered in the context of mockery, right? She's someone that we like to reflect on in a really critical kind of way as just being this silly, somewhat awful parent whose presence and role is strictly tied to comic relief. So even in the case of Mrs. Bennet, we're not necessarily remembering her in the context of a mother or in the context of what we perhaps feel a proper mother should embody. And one final question to think about before we move to the next slide. Why do heroines in Austen's novels so often succeed without maternal guidance? These are all things worth considering, worth questioning. Because as I said, in actuality, maternal authority is central to Austen's novels. Mothers actually occupy a really significant space in Austen's works, even when they're not physically present. And Austen, I think it's important to remember when we're thinking about the mothers in the books, the presence of the mothers, right? Austen was very much a writer who based her fictional worlds upon the real life society around her. And certainly in Jane Austen's world, mothers played a huge role. When it comes to what Austen pulls from to generate her texts, to build her universes, one of the things that I talked about in my presentation last summer was the fact that she's not just, or she shouldn't just be remembered as a marriage plot novelist or a romance novelist. She also really kind of wrote a realistic type of fiction before that genre took concrete shape, right? Basing her fictional world on her real life reality. So when we think about mothers and the role that mothers played in Regency England, they fretted over their daughters' futures, they ran households, they vetted potential suitors, and they did their very best to guide their daughters, or at least that's what they were supposed to be doing. That was their assigned role within a very patriarchal society. And so throughout Austen's works, we are confronted with mothers, but we are confronted with mothers who possess interesting traits, right? We are presented with overbearing mothers, passive and disengaged mothers, mothers who are absent altogether. And Austen seems to really parade before us a series of mothers whose authority is ineffective when guidance is needed the most. Why is that? Why does she so often portray them as ineffective figures? Well, if we're thinking about the question of if mothers are responsible for preparing their daughters for adulthood, why are they so rarely relied upon by Austen's heroines? We might find in response to this question the fact or the recollection that Austen was very much a writer in tune and in step with what she felt were very real issues within the society that she dwelt. And gender roles was very much of concern to her. And so when we think about the role of the mothers in Jane Austen's novels, we should also be thinking about the fact that Austen was more than likely very deeply reflecting on the consequences of the limitations put onto the females in Regency era England. And subsequently, the pressures that those limitations frequently led to. So my belief and the argument that I'm making is that Austen purposefully juxtaposes anxious, flawed, and even absent mothers with independent daughters in order to examine the limits of maternal authority within Regency England. In a marriage-driven culture, Austen's fictional daughters arrive at maturity mainly through self-reflection and the guidance of surrogate maternal figures as opposed to their biological mothers. And as a result of this maternal ineffectiveness coming from their biological mothers for a variety of reasons, our heroines in Jane Austen's novels are maturing through self-reflection, right? And this is sort of flipping the script on how the narrative is coming across. It's redefining the marriage plot, if you will, as being a narrative centered on female moral autonomy. So while it's easy for us to perhaps directly go from here to a critique of Austen's mothers, it is important to, again, make sure that we have a good understanding of the world in which these mothers were operating. Returning to that thought of what happens as a result of severe limitations being placed upon an individual. In this case, the limitations placed upon women in Regency era England. It's important for us to really hone in on the fact that women had very limited opportunities in Regency England. Women's reality was kind of, to a certain extent, bleak in terms of not having a whole lot of creative liberty where their futures were concerned. And marriage in Regency England tended to be the best and perhaps arguably the only way that a woman could gain any kind of financial stability, social status. After all, property laws favored male inheritance, and professional opportunities were both extremely limited and actually frequently associated with the lesser privileged, frowned upon. Right? If we think about Pride and Prejudice, think about Mrs. Bennet. It's almost a guarantee that she would have been horrified if her daughters went on to become governesses. Marriage provided security and status, because security and status was all but impossible for a woman to gain otherwise. And if it's the mother's role to steer the courtship process, then we should keep in mind that mothers carried enormous responsibility for their daughters' futures and would have felt immense pressure. And what does pressure tend to produce? Stress, anxiety. So this socially produced anxiety is something that, in my opinion, Austen really saw a lot of women struggling with, especially mothers. Now, these mothers faced with this difficult duty, placed into a role that required them to ensure their daughters' futures while having to accept the fact that they possessed relatively little power in the society they were living in, led to, understandably, immense pressure, generated, in turn, anxiety. And no mother in Austen's works illustrates this better, actually, than Mrs. Bennet, the mother that I think, many of us are so quick to condemn or laugh at, right? But when we as forget about just women, when we as humans are placed under immense pressure and end up having stress and anxiety, that tends to lead to desperation. It tends to lead to poor judgment because we are driven by our stress. We're driven by our anxiety. And so, yeah, I said it. Mrs. Bennet, the mother that so many of us are most likely to roll our eyes at, groan over, or even poke fun at. She is someone worth turning to first as a really perfect example of Austen demonstrating the consequences of what happens when maternal figures are placed under immense amount of societal pressure to secure the financial security and social stability of their female offspring. So let's reconsider Mrs. Bennet, shall we? As as someone, I want to challenge you to think of her as someone more than just comic relief, or as someone more than just an incompetent mother, as someone more than just an ignorant individual. Mrs. Bennet is perhaps the most famous comic creation of Jane Austen because we remember her for her poor nerves, especially in all of the film adaptations. We remember her for her absolute obsession with marriage and her countless indiscretions. But are we meant to read her as comedic? Are we actually supposed to see her as comedic? Because beneath all the seemingly comedic layers of Mrs. Bennet, there exists a genuine social reality. Remember, the Bennet estate is entailed away from the daughters. Longbourn is not ever going to go to Jane Bennet because Jane was not born James. Longbourn instead is going to pass to Mr. Collins, and Mrs. Bennet absolutely understands what this means. None of her daughters have guaranteed financial security. Their security can only be obtained through making good matches. Suddenly, in my opinion anyway, Mrs. Bennet's anxiety, manifested in her poor nerves, seems a whole lot less silly. So beneath the comedy lies a serious concern. How will her daughters survive financially? And I would even go so far as to suggest that Mrs. Bennet sees a danger that Mr. Bennet largely ignores. While her husband retreats into his books and those famous comedically timed sarcastic zingers, it's Mrs. Bennet who remains invested in the future of her daughters, albeit in utterly cringeworthy and questionable ways. So, what is Austen doing here with the creation of Mrs. B? Well, she's asking us to recognize that Mrs. Bennet's concerns are legitimate. She's asking us to acknowledge the social conditions that generate maternal anxiety. I'll say it a bit differently. Mrs. Bennet's fears are legit. Her methods, not so much. This distinction is crucial. And it's not just Mrs. Bennet who worries. In my opinion, Austen is not birthing characters like Mrs. Bennet for the sole sake of mocking the overly caring mother. No, instead, she's using characters like Mrs. Bennet to demonstrate how a system organized around marriage puts women between a rock and a hard place. Mothers and daughters alike are placed under immense pressure with limited options as to how they can overcome those pressures. And as I said, it's not just Mrs. Bennet who embodies this. Let's think about Mrs. Dashwood, for example, who worries about how economically vulnerable her family becomes following the death of her husband. And then what about the surrogate mother, Lady Russell, who fears Anne will ruin her future by marrying a man with uncertain prospects, who feels the immense pressure of stepping into the role of mother in the absence of her best friend who is deceased. And this sort of understanding that we as readers have that there was this offstage promise made by Lady Russell to Anne Elliot's mother that she would be a motherly figure of sorts to Anne. We are repeatedly faced with maternal figures in Austen's novels who try to prevent the heroines from having unstable futures, truly. But these figures are frequently driven by their anxieties, which all too often results in the heroines either eventually or fairly quickly, in the case of Elizabeth Bennet, for example, developing a distrust in the ability these maternal figures have to steer them in the right direction. And so that brings us to the limitations of maternal authority that Austen seems to want to draw our attention to. If we were to consider all of her novels, maternal failure appears in three forms: overbearing involvement, think Mrs. Bennet, passive disengagement, and complete absence. So let's break those down, starting with the overbearing mother. We return to Mrs. Bennet, whose priority is securing husbands for her daughters, regardless of their moral suitability. Frankly, as long as there's an outward appearance of financial stability, Mrs. Bennet is all for it, making the grave mistake of not pausing to question either the individual's character or if perhaps the way things appear are not actually as they really are. She's teaching attraction, not judgment, especially when it comes to the youngest Bennet sisters. The flaws of Mrs. Bennet's approach is quite evident when we consider her guidance, if we want to call it guidance, of Lydia. Because instead of encouraging restraint, she positively delights in Lydia's flirtation and reckless behavior where Wickham is concerned. She views Wickham's projected self as his genuine self, and consequently miserably fails Lydia from a maternal standpoint. Austen makes it quite clear through the evolution of her leading ladies that successful adulthood depends upon moral discernment, not social performance. But social performance seems to be what Mrs. Bennet cares about, all Mrs. Bennet cares about. And so, therefore, her authority fails. She's too focused on outcomes and not worried enough about principles. Next, we have the passive mother. Lady Bertram is the perfect example of this. If Mrs. Bennet represents excessive involvement, Mansfield Park's Lady Bertram is the epitome of maternal indifference. She might physically be present, but from the perspective of emotional engagement, Lady Bertram is not at home. Rarely does she exert any kind of meaningful authority over either her daughters or her household. Instead, she seems quite content with her daily routines, prioritizing personal comfort over any type of parenting. And the consequences of her behavior are quite visible in her daughters, Maria and Julia. Both of Lady Bertram's daughters are vain and selfish. And Mariah's disastrous marriage to Mr. Rushworth, along with the scandal that follows, perfectly illustrates what happens when a daughter fails to receive any kind of moral education from her mother. So once again, we are faced with an example of a maternal figure failing to provide genuine moral guidance. By contrast, it's just interesting as a side note to draw attention to the fact that Fanny Price, who is the leading heroine of Mansfield Park, but who arguably at times takes a backseat to some of the dramas happening with other females in the text. Fanny Price develops integrity largely without maternal influence, right? Because not only does Fanny have an absent mother, but Fanny also has a passive surrogate mother in the form of her aunt. Lady Bertram can't even be bothered to parent her own daughters, let alone her ward, her niece. And so now we turn to the absent mother. Persuasion and Emma are the best examples of this. Mothers who are removed altogether from the narrative. In both Persuasion and Emma, the mothers are absent, they're deceased. And yet, instead of Emma and Anne being depicted by Austen as helpless as a result of these absences, they are presented as women who gradually learn how to trust themselves. So this maternal vacuum that's created as a result of the deaths of Lady Elliot and Emma's mother actually leads to a sort of emerging female independence in the absence of that traditional maternal authority. It would almost seem that maternal absence paves the way for the heroine to establish independence. We should not, however, interpret this as Austen celebrating the literal or metaphorical loss of mothers. Instead, we should consider the possibility that she's using these absences to reflect on what could happen when young women are faced with constructing their own moral identities. When they are thrust into a position where they have to get a little bit creative in terms of how they are interacting with and internalizing the world around them. And so the narrative is shifting from parental guidance to self-development. Emma, Anne, and Fanny are all daughters who become responsible for judgments that traditionally would have belonged to their parents. Arguably, we can place Elizabeth into this category as well. The result of this is that the reader is presented with narratives that focus far more on female self-development than they do on parental direction. So we've spent a lot of time so far thinking about the way maternal authority crops up in Austen's books and the ways in which maternal authority seems to fail the daughters. So it begs the question then of where Austen's heroines are finding guidance. Because there is this common pattern that exists amongst Austen's heroines that points to the answer. They are finding themselves through an emerging independence. They are learning how to self-reflect. They are learning how to evaluate advice critically. They are learning from their mistakes. Right? Think about Elizabeth and Wickham. They're developing independent judgments. Maturity is coming through self-knowledge rather than obedience. And so I would argue that the guidance they're finding can be found in both themselves, but also through alternative models of guidance. Surrogate mothers. It's important to recognize that in a lot of Austen's works, Yes, there is a lot of self-development emerging as a result of self-initiative, self-reflection, maturity that is being generated from the self. But many of them also have some helping hands or some hands that are trying to be helpful. So let's start with arguably the best example of an Austen heroine who looks to her own judgment, but who also has a pretty significant surrogate mother, Elizabeth Bennet. So in terms of her independent emergence, right, she consistently resists Mrs. Bennet's attempts to shape her future. She refuses Mr. Collins' proposal despite family pressure and despite having an awareness of the significance of marrying the man who's going to inherit Longbourn. She reconsiders her assumptions about Darcy. She recognizes her own mistakes concerning both Darcy and Wickham, and Charlotte for that matter, her best friend. She does all of this through self-reflection rather than through obedience. Her growth belongs to her. But it's also important to recognize that Elizabeth is not without a helping hand, right? She has her aunt, Mrs. Gardiner. Unlike Mrs. Bennet, Elizabeth's aunt listens, observes, and advises without coming across as controlling. She respects Elizabeth and trusts in her niece's ability to make her own decisions. So while Mrs. Gardiner is a literal mother herself of her own children, she is also a surrogate mother for her niece, stepping in to fill the shoes of a dissatisfactory biological mother, Mrs. Bennet. So in Elizabeth Bennet's case, we've got emerging female agency alongside the presence of alternative guidance. The same can be said for Anne Elliot, even though Lady Russell is not perfect, right? So despite the fact that Lady Russell initially places a lot of importance on picking the right suitor from a financial standpoint, she does make repeated and well-intentioned efforts to steer Anne in the right direction. And even though she steers Anne off course at first, she should still be viewed as a surrogate mother worth valuing because her errors stem from genuine concern. She really wants what's best for Anne. Now, Anne herself, by the end of Persuasion, she's learned how to trust her own judgment. So even though she initially places way too much confidence in an external maternal-like authority figure, she eventually gets to a place where she has intellectual independence. She gains intellectual independence. She also achieves romantic fulfillment because she no longer depends on someone else's evaluation of her future. She no longer depends on someone else's evaluation of her self-worth, right? She learns how to drive her own story in the same way that Elizabeth Bennet does. Guidance succeeds when it encourages independent thinking. Another surrogate mother who's not on this slide, but who's worth mentioning because of the complexity of it all, is actually Elinor Dashwood. We see Elinor Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility taking on a surrogate mother role when it comes to her sister Marianne, because the biological mother, Mrs. Dashwood, is in that category of anxiety where she's so focused on economic vulnerabilities. She's not really all that in tune with what's happening in her daughter's lives, let alone her daughter's love lives. And we see that play out time and time again throughout the entire narrative arc of Sense and Sensibility. So ultimately, readers are perhaps meant to view Austen's depiction of mothers and daughters through the following lens. Austen is flipping the script on traditional courtship narratives. Traditional courtship narratives entail family authority, social approval, successful parental management. She's flipping that script. And by weakening maternal authority in her works, Austen is making room for female self-discovery. She's making room for this new version of a marriage plot, where it's about self-discovery, moral growth, independent judgment. She's enabling her heroines, her daughters, to embark on internal journeys that culminate in the women being rewarded, not for their obedience, but for their self-awareness, being rewarded for their agency. Elizabeth overcomes prejudice, Anne overcomes deference, Emma overcomes arrogance, Marianne overcomes impulsiveness. Mothers occupy a central place in Austen's fiction, absolutely. But they do not drive their daughters' success. Some of the mothers are overwhelmed by anxiety, others are passive, some are completely absent. And then there are the ones who do the best they can in their role of surrogate. But ultimately, the daughters are making their own decisions, experiencing their own journeys, which of course is what makes the daughters, aka the leading heroines, so memorable. But that doesn't mean that Austen wants us to forget the mothers. She's not dismissing mothers. She's simply imagining another possibility. Guidance is valuable, but wisdom cannot be inherited. And so the tension between mothers and daughters lends the reader to Austen's theoretical purpose. I'm going to say that again because I froze video-wise. Guidance is valuable, but wisdom cannot be inherited. Tension between mothers and daughters leads the reader to Austen's theoretical proposal concerning the female experience. A woman cannot truly be happy if she hasn't first embarked on a journey of self-awareness that is entirely her own. Austen's daughters emerge as reflective, independent, and morally autonomous, even in the midst of anxious, passive, absent, surrogate mothers. Mothers are central to Austen's novels, yes, and they should not be forgotten. They should not be dismissed. They should not be pushed aside and not considered at all, because they do play a very key role in the growth of our heroines, in the growth of Austen's daughters. They just play a role in that growth in a very unique way, lending a hand to the commentary Austen is wanting to make on the society in which she is living in. And that final thought, that final takeaway, that final interpretation, which is just one interpretation of millions, probably, right? When we try to think about and figure out authorial intent, there's no one right answer. Depending on the topic of a presentation, depending on the angle in which you choose to dissect a novel, authorial intent is going to be different every single time, right? Or I should say perceived authorial intent is going to be different every single time. But in the context of this presentation, in the context of this line of thinking, that authorial intent seems to revolve around the final thought of, it bears repeating, a woman cannot truly be happy if she hasn't first embarked on a journey of self-awareness that is entirely her own. And in order to depict this journey of self-awareness, Austen is using the maternal figures in her texts to really beautifully illustrate the progression and perhaps the reasoning behind the progression of her female heroines, of her leading daughters. So, with that being said, thank you so much for your time and attention. Before I wrap, I wanted to say a couple of things. I'll actually briefly go back 2 slides to, oop, that was more than 3 slides. There we go. I'll just go to this slide really quickly as a kind of a demonstration. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the photos in this presentation. So all of the pictures on these slides were taken by me. I went to the Morgan Library and Museum in July of 2025 last year as part of the 250th celebration for Jane Austen. The Morgan Library and Museum put on a Jane Austen exhibition. And so all of the pictures in here were taken at that exhibit by myself. As for my resources, my sources, if you will, I wanted to briefly address the variety of sources that I revisited. I actually reread all of these. These were all books that I had read before, either relatively recently or many, many times or several years ago, depending on book in question. But I wanted to start by highlighting the complete Cambridge collection of Jane Austen, the collector's edition that was put out for Austen's 250th. This collector's edition has prefaces and notes from the amazing Janet Todd, who is a renowned Austen scholar, right up there with Lucy Worsley. And she's one of my favorite Austen scholars. And so I used my Cambridge collection for this presentation, specifically revisiting Emma, Persuasion, and Pride and Prejudice. There was no way for me, it wouldn't let me cite like the box set, so I just kind of broke it down in the individual texts. I also revisited my copy of Wild for Austen, A Rebellious, Subversive, and Untamed Jane by Devoney Looser, and highly recommend this book. This also came out in honor of Jane Austen's 250th. I'm referencing the paperback version, and this is an author who really dives into the question of all the different ways in which we can interpret Jane Austen's works. Rory Muir's Love and Marriage and the Age of Jane Austen, that Regency era fuel. That is a bedrock for all of Austen's works because, again, she wrote about the world in which she was living in. And then, of course, my beloved copy of Rebecca Romney's Jane Austen's Bookshelf, the one that I structured an entire presentation off last year. I couldn't not give myself a reason, an excuse to revisit that amazing book. If you haven't read it, you need to, like ASAP, or audio if that's more your thing. Okay, so I want to have a final kind of nod by saying that if any of you would like to connect with me, you are very welcome to do so. I would love to engage with you, hear from you. It would be in the Bookstagram corner of the Instagram community. You can find me at Musings of the Well-Read. Please don't be scared off by my private setting. I just have that for personal reasons. All you have to do is request to follow me and I will accept, and then we can engage. My content is 98.9% book related. So if nothing else, you'll get some interesting commentary on the various books that I read, but I would be happy to connect with any and all of you who are willing to do so. Thank you again very much for attending my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoy the rest of Virtual JaneCon 2026. And with that, I will sign off. Thank you again.